Yes, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the near witching hour here in good old South Africa. We are going to be beaming to you not only from the southern continent of the world, but maybe in a few years from now, it might be the all upside down. And it might be a different continent altogether. Now, if that sounds a little bit mysterious, it's simply because tonight's episode of Storytime we're going to be talking about not only the origins of humanity, uh, Homo sapien, or a little bit before that, but generally we're also going to be looking at the cycles and cataclysms that have shaped our Earth. Now, it's a bit of a deviation, some might say, from our usual programming about UAPs, UFOs, remote viewing, parapsychology. What else do we look at? We look at everything. But you'll find that we'll double back, and in previous episodes, for example, we've looked at people like Edgar Cayce and Atlantis, things like that, and you'll see those themes will come back to us this evening. So welcome to StoryTime 24. Can you believe it? We're getting through these episodes quite quickly. So I welcome everyone that's been following us, encourage everyone who's new to go check out our previous episodes to maybe try and get a little bit more up to speed. It's not that you won't understand what's happening here, but there would just be more context, as always. And if you don't know who I am, I'm your friendly Euphoria, just some dude on the internet. And I'm just here to bring you some interesting mystery. Because when you kind of look at the historical record of not only this planet and our time on it, but that of the whole solar system, you begin to find that there are very fascinating aspects that bring forward these deep mysteries, which, being as old as they are, come to us in various ways. Sometimes it's science, through radio telescopes, sometimes it's maths, sometimes it's myth and lore and legend, and all of these things come together and tell us a very amazing story. And not just one story, many stories of the attempts for life to grab a foothold on this planet, and how many times that's been skewed in many different ways by just the forces of nature. So we're not going to go too deep into the UAP and UFOs. They're going to come up a little bit, extraterrestrials. We are, and so are others, to relative entities going to have that opposing effect. We are definitely aliens to the aliens. Let's just put it that way. So we're all just on this earth and in this universe, just trying to maximize our being, trying to become the best versions of ourselves we can be with everyone around us, hopefully in positive connections. That's my hope, at least. And as I mentioned, I'm just some dude on the internet. I'm not an expert or any such thing. I just try to have a little bit of fun and share an interesting open dialogue with you guys. I learn from you, as you maybe, possibly, learn from me. And let's kick this evening off straight away. We're going to try and cover a lot of information, as much as we can. We're going to go for about 2 and a smidge hours. I estimate, might go longer. You know how these things are. But as I was saying, most of the information I try give is just off the top of my head. Nothing is scripted, as you can hear from my blabbering sometimes and non sequitur ideas every now and again. But it is real, and it's shared, and it's open to the light of discourse. So I'm not afraid to make mistakes, but I do make mistakes. So as always, check your own facts, get your own story straight, and I'll lead you down the various rabbit holes as we go forward in story time. So everyone, welcome to number 24. This is going to be quite an exciting episode, because there are basically 3 main themes that we're going to interlock this evening. The first one is the natural cycles of the Earth. The second is the incredible cataclysms that come with those cycles. And then the third and last thing is what that meant for the story of humanity. Where do we come from? How many mass extinctions have there been? When is the next one? Could there have been other civilizations before us? And if so, how far back? What are we talking about here? That's more or less the direction I'm going to be taking you all this evening. So, do get your warm beverage ready. And let's get the show on the road, shall we? So, this evening we are going to start with just a bit of background to try get us into this mindset necessary to really grasp the enormity of what we are talking about, geologically speaking, historically speaking, because we're dealing with cataclysm here. Now, cataclysm is not just, some really big hurricane creating damage in one spot on the earth. It's global. It's everywhere all at once, and it's maximal, usually. Or at least in the way we're talking about it in this case, in terms of very big cycles that completely reshape the earth. Now, this can come from a lot of different sources. It can come from meteor impacts, it can come from solar flares, coronal mass ejections, it can come from mega quakes, mega volcanoes. All kinds of pole shifts and things will do a number on our civilization. Some say the crust of human existence is very thin upon the planet which we live. But I want to share with you a different quote this evening. I want to start with a quote by George Bernard Shaw. And he says, "All great truths begin as blasphemy." Now, not to take that too far out of context, what he means by that is, the first time you say something extremely radical, and you base it upon whatever truths you gather, and you test and hopefully bring as high quality and information to your peers around you. But if the content of that information, be it true and well researched and logically formed, if the truth is incredibly difficult to swallow, it's not always certain that all your peers will take it with a pat on the back. Some might challenge it, maybe rightfully so, but others might actually get violent and hostile. When you challenge paradigms and conceptual beliefs, you are challenging the core of a being's compass with reality. So this is inversely why it's so important to actually spend some time talking about our origins. Because the deeper you go into that, the more you can put a root down, even if that history might be uncomfortable, The fact is, knowing creates a centeredness. It allows you to put the information in the right place, in your psyche, in your spirit. At least that's my belief. And I think that's often why people, maybe even in this day and age, feel very lost. Something has detached them, and they don't really know where they sit in the grand scope of existence. They feel maybe perhaps disconnected. So, I'm here to tell you that everything is connected. And our story goes back much further than our books can ever tell. I'm going to start firstly with something called the Silurian hypothesis. Now, what is the Silurian hypothesis? This is basically a hypothesis put forward in a book by two people, Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt. So the Cerulean hypothesis is basically saying to us that of the total life that has been on this planet in terms of time, we have been in that pie chart approximately 0.0002%. So, in the millions of years that there has been life on this planet, we've only been around for a few 100,000, maybe a mil, as upright walking, sort of half intelligent humanoids, you know? Now, it's a big question where one would put the stick of where modern man begins. But all the same, I'd like to maybe postulate that the Neolithic period is an interesting point to start. Now, for those of you that don't know where the Neolithic period starts, we'll jump into it in more precision. But it's basically the last ice age, because as we come out of it, we go from being quite prehistoric in a certain sense, carved flint and using stone tools, basic knowledge of fire, to suddenly an incredible Neolithic renaissance of just agriculture and language and astronomy and all these things all at once. It's very strange, historically speaking. Now, the Cerulean hypothesis also says that our evolution is sort of exponential, not just linear. It maybe logarithmic is perhaps the right way to put it. In other words, it's not just adding 1 at a time, it's doubling. It's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32 instead of 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's an interesting concept, and they put forward a couple of ideas. But what I'm really interested in when we're talking about the Cerulean hypothesis is basically the fact that they say that with the way we have the land of the earth recycling itself, basically the crust, we learn this in geography in high school, the plate tectonics of the world, one folds in and gets recycled and new matter pushes up some other place, and so we go from Pangea to all the different continents we see today, roughly speaking. Now, the fact that the land is recycling itself, they say, is problematic because as old as the Earth is, how do we know if there have been previous civilizations? We've got modern recorded history going back about 12,500 years, 11,500 years, roughly. And there's some things that appear to be much older, but the modern narrative disputes that. But the point here is that, putting all of that aside, if we wanted to know in the millions of years of this planet, was there other life possible? We would probably find it in ways that were unexpected, because now we're looking at archaeology and radiocarbon dating and, myth and all these kinds of things. But certain structures would not last millions of years, especially after many cataclysms. Our cities are not designed to last more than a few, maybe let's say 1,000 years. If you keep a building and you just leave it there for 1,000 years and you come back, that building is gonna look pretty much like a heap. Just a heap of, weathered sand, basically, I guess. Now, I'm not an expert. I'm just sort of using my imagination to simulate that. But I know for a fact that that building will not be standing. And you would probably be wise not to set foot anywhere under, on, or, in it. So, structures that the ancients built, even for example, Göbekli Tepe and some of the other places found in Turkey, these seem to go really far back. And the other is Dr. Schock's analysis of the erosion in the inner enclosure of the Sphinx, indicating a place that had much rain. The last time the Sahara Desert was capable of such rainfall was many, many, many thousands of years ago, kind of collaborating again with that 11,500 odd mark, give or take 500 years. So there seems to be something interesting there, but if you try and go further back, you run into problems. Simply because, as I said, things don't last long enough to see what a previous civilization, maybe 20 million years ago, had built. Because maybe that land even just gets recycled after such long geological time. So, the idea here is, what do we look for? And the Cyrillian hypothesis comes forward with a few ideas. One of the things you would basically see if there was some form of really ancient trace of a civilization, you would probably want to look at some form of radiocarbon dating at the level of an isotope. Because, if these races previously, these hypothetical ancient civilizations, were advanced enough, they'd be making some kind of an impact on the planet. And that would change the isotope composition of many things. So, for example, you would see a large spike in metals, carbon, oxygen, temperatures. These kinds of things would suddenly be very interestingly concentrated. For example, if you look at humanity spread across the space of the Earth, we maybe occupy 1% of it. Of the total Earth's, I suppose most of it is sea, but it's if you were looking, assume that lands moved and changed, and you would be looking kind of like for a needle in a haystack, is more or less what I'm trying to say here, if you go as far back as we're trying to here. But looking at the metal concentrations, you would see, there was perhaps a city here. Why would, it's unnatural that such traces of certain elements would be found, not underground but above ground, or missing from underground. Even that, lack of evidence is sometimes evidence. And, if you kind of take the Drake equation that looks at the possibility of civilizations across the cosmos, the possibility of intelligent life on other planets that are habitable and sort of Earth-like, you would, Fermi says that there would be many. We should be living amongst a cosmic brotherhood in a certain sense. But the Cyrillian hypothesis kind of looks locally towards Earth and says, how would we be able to even know if there was previous races going back millions of years? And the answer is, again, you would look at metal and carbon and the temperatures of the Earth. In fact, there's been quite a few interesting traces, let's say, because that's your hypothesis. You do some measurements, and basically Frank and Schmidt found some traces in the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum. So let me put this on screen for you guys. We'll put some things up here. So, for example, this is a Wired article. Let me put that on screen for you. And you can see here, even Wired is writing about it, and they say that Today we get an answer thanks to Gavin Schmidt at NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies in New York City and Adam Frank at the University of Rochester. These guys have a name for the idea that an industrial civilization may have predated humanity. It's known as the Cerulean hypothesis. They study the signature of our own civilization, which is likely to leave behind traces, and they ask whether it would be detectable by others millions of years from now. The conclusion is that a probable impact on the planet would be palpable in some way and hard to distinguish from various other events in the geological record, but their work has some interesting implications for how we should study Earth and the impact we have on it. So I'm going to basically, take Wired's interpretation and say, that's great, but there's more to it than that, because it is an interesting way to try and probe backwards. And when we get to things like the we were saying the thermal maximum from the Paleo-Eocene era. See if I can pull that up for you. So here we go. And you can see that it was during the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum, otherwise known as PETM, which happened 56 million years ago. Now, 56 million years ago, the planet warmed by 5 to 8 degrees. Deep-sea organisms went extinct, oceans rapidly acidified, geochemical records from the fossil shell of a group of plankton called Foraminifera record how much ocean pH decreased during the Paleo-Eocene thermal maximum. Now, the Earth is kind of like an organism. It's kind of like your body. If your body shoots up 8 degrees from its core temperature, or down 8 degrees, or even 6 or 5, it's possibly life-threatening to you. Now, what I'm trying to say there is that a small change in temperature can have a very big effect, especially on the planet. So 8 degrees hotter, I mean, they say that this could be an example, a very erroneous and unexplainable mystery, and one that could maybe show that in the past there was an industrial civilization that pumped large amounts of carbon into the air. Now, detractors will say that that could also happen from mega volcanoes and all kinds of eruptions and meteors and many things maybe even happening at once. But it's still a bit of a mystery. In fact, there is the Eocene layers of mysterious origin. I kid you not. There you go. They even have this thing, ETM2. Okay, let me pull this up on Wikipedia. Might be interesting. I want to see some pictures. Eocene thermal maximum 2. So this is another time. This transient period of global warming, quote unquote. It appears to be the second major hyperthermal that punctuated the long-term warming trend for the late Paleocene through the Eocene, which was 58 to 50 million years ago. So now, hyperthermal means very, very hot. Hyper. And, again, it's what's mysterious about it is that we don't really know what caused it with that kind of composition. One possible answer is that you're getting some kind of technology or industry that is causing some kind of global warming. That is kind of the hypothesis. There's other, maybe perhaps natural explanations, but it really is Very strange. It happens to be a minor thermal event that followed ETM2. They call it H1. And that was about 1,000 years. This led to speculation that the two events are somehow coupled. And so, you see the sea surface temperatures climbed about 2 to 4 degrees, and the salinity was also higher. It's a very interesting marker in the history of our planet, something we should pay attention to and be aware of. So the Cerulean hypothesis, now, if you don't know where the word Cerulean comes from, it's actually from Doctor Who. And I think the Ceruleans are actually reptilians. Let me check that. Let's check. Let me not. I haven't seen a lot of Doctor Who. Oh yeah, there you go. The Cerulean, Doctor Who. I did remember this correctly. Check him out. Anyways, so, some sci-fi reference there from good old Adam Frank and Gavin Schmidt. So, yeah, kind of fascinating. Good old Ceruleans. Lizard people and whatnot. So anyways, moving forward. You can see that there are ways to look backward in human history and try and see, was there some other kind of intelligent life that might have grown and evolved? Millions of years are quite great. I mean, we've only, again, been around for the blink of a cosmic eye, for the planet. That's at least the case. So, not only, I just want to mention, do we look backwards and see things like mass extinctions, and if I remember, there's 5 of them. Yes. So there was one about 450 million years ago, 375 million years ago, and then the third one was the Great Dying. That's when, like, the planet lost 96% or something crazy like that of all life forms on this planet, plants and animals. Wrecked. Decimation. That's cataclysm. I'd lock down for something like that. But nothing short. That's real cataclysm, I just want to say. 96% of all organic living creatures and organisms on this planet. It's terrible. And that was 252 million years ago. There was another one 200 odd million years ago. And then the last one was about 65, 66 million years ago. And that was the KT asteroid that basically raped the dinosaurs. It showed them. Oh, poor dinosaurs. So, there's been, goodness gracious, slap chippies. I absolutely love my slap chippies. For those of you that don't know what that is, in South Africa, it's delicious. Salt and vinegar and tomato sauce on the side of the road, done fried chips. It's cheap and it's delicious. And thank you so much for joining the stream and joining the chats. Always welcome. So we were just saying that the evidence for the whole Cerulean concept gives us a really, really fantastic idea about how we can look very far back in time, millions of years, at some kind of a record about how we've affected the planet. And there have been a few things that have stood out to us. We looked at a few of the thermal maximums and the very strange layers that we also find. Now, for those of you that are perhaps fans of Randall Carlson, Graham Hancock, and good old Joe Rogan, who's had them on a bunch of times, you will see that cataclysm and mass extinction events come in many different ways and flavors. One way that you can track these mass and sudden changes to the Earth is by also looking at the ice core records. And then the magnetic part, you can look at the lava. Because as lava solidifies, it kind of keeps a bit of a record of the magnetic status of the Earth's orientation at that time. So if you look at these things, my goodness, many just incredible things pop out. Now, I'm going to play this clip here for you. This is from when Randall Carlson met up with Graham Hancock on the Joe Rogan Experience. This was quite some time ago, but the whole idea kind of applies here. And what they're talking about is basically how when you look at certain geography mixed with a whole bunch of other things, it's not just one discipline. You have to kind of be multidisciplined in these studies. Now, for example, in the Sahara, you'll see here, I was going to pull it on the screen for you, there are these interesting ripples, and they are going to show not to be just regular sand dunes, but something of a nature that absolutely rattled the earth in its at its very core. It must have to have scarred the landscape the way it has. Let's have a listen to good old Randall Carlson and Joe Rogan and Graham Hancock. Wise folk. I highly recommend all of their books and their podcasts, and especially good old Randall Carlson. He's got big fascination with sacred geometry and different ways of using science for taking what we've learnt over all these thousands of years and trying to apply it in ways that are not constrained by just incremental mainstream scientific ways. It's kind of like taking real science but trying to do revolutionary thinking with it. So he's got an excellent podcast to listen to. Let's jump into it, shall we?
Yeah, you look at this one, that way you can hit the mic right in front of you.
Okay, this is the beginning, but okay, here's what we're
Get
looking at.
that mic right up to you there.
We're looking at a place in western Montana called Camas Prairie, and you see some hills in the foreground, and you see a basin in the background.
Apologies, I said it was the Sahara Desert, but it's a prairie in North America. My apologies, but the same point applies. Let's go further.
Right? Okay. Right here on top of this hill and down on the side here, you see that there are some quarrying operations. Those are quarrying gravel, because everything you're looking at here, this whole landscape between the hills, are these large masses of gravel, trillions of tons of gravel. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to start sweeping around as the video plays, and you're going to notice down here a series of ripples.
Oh, okay, I see that.
Okay, and I'm going to have Jamie pause in a second, but let's keep coming around. Do you start seeing the ripples on the landscape? Let's pause right there. Right there, let's pause. Now, I wish I had a pointer, but if you look up, you're going to see a flat piece of land like a tongue coming out, rounded. Yeah, Jamie's right here. That's
to get you a laser.
That's a delta. That's a delta. You know what a delta is? You ever heard of a delta? It's when a river comes into a body of water and it's carrying sediment. And because the river is moving along swiftly, it's carrying the sediment, but when it comes into the standing body of water, it slows down and it drops its sediment. It builds a delta. The whole city of Portland, for example, is built on a giant delta, right? New Orleans is built on a delta, right? Okay, so what we're seeing there is a delta. And then in front of it, we're seeing rippled landscape. Let's keep coming around, Jamie. And so
rippled landscape that looks exactly like the beach looks.
Yeah, keep coming around with
That's
that.
the thing, it's fractal, because this is the whole mystery of this, that this happens at a scale of inches on beaches and a scale of hundreds of feet here.
Stop again.
Good Lord.
Now, right here in the middle, you see a massive delta.
Yes.
Spewed out like a big tongue, splayed out. And then right down here, you start seeing the ripples. And there's a farmhouse. You see the farmhouse there? Now, those ripples are, the tallest ones are about the height of a 5-story building.
Whoa. How bizarre.
Let's keep swinging around
Let's
here.
just stop this for a second,
Okay.
if you don't mind.
No, I don't
So
mind.
these things, they're the size of a 5-story building. What is that, like 70 feet or something
50
like that?
feet.
50 feet?
50
Okay.
feet.
So those are 50 feet high. And how much water?
We'll get to that. Let's see the rest of it.
We'll get to that, Joe Rogan. Just calm down. You're being impatient. Randall Carson going to tell you exactly how to get schooled on how the land gets scarred by incredible amounts of fast-moving water.
And these are just dirt, right?
They're well. If you dig into one, what you're going to find is they're a massive. Okay, let's pause again.
Whoa.
Look at this.
This is crazy.
This is totally crazy. This is one of the craziest things you'll ever see.
These ripples, repeated ripples in an area where there's nothing else like it.
This is the fingerprints of the flood. That's what it is.
Wow.
There you go. The fingerprints of the floods. Now, you will see this in various places. The Sahara, the Scablands. There's the Richat structure itself is quite amazing. Now, for those of you that don't know what the Richat or the Richat structure is, it's basically this circular, concentrically ringed feature in Mauritania, and it's massive. So let's look at that. So the Richat structure, as mentioned, it's kilometers long. It's a huge geographical scar on the earth. It's a massive feature. So we're not talking small scale here. As Randall Carlson was saying, some of those waves that you would normally see on like a beach rippling from water receding or rushing is nearly 5 stories high and shows an incredible amount of water passing through it. So let's first check here the Richat structure. Now, as I mentioned, this is in Mauritania, and they sometimes refer to it as a kind of volcanic dome, but it's very unique in many of its features. Here you can see some of the pictures of it. Now, when Plato describes how Atlantis had these concentric rings and had access to the ocean, what you can see with some of these images is that here's perhaps a good one. You can see at the bottom here, let me try and blow this up. Okay, so you can see here, at this bottom section, you can actually see the flow as something washes everything away here. And that flow, you will see, even go as far as the ocean. So if we check it out on Google Maps, you'll see I suppose we should have done it more with Google Earth, right? Okay. Now, it's sometimes known as the Eye of the Sahara, or Sahara. And the Sahara is one of the oldest deserts, but it has gone through many changes. It hasn't always been desert, and there's even evidence that beneath it there are quite interesting remnants of rivers. Now, I'm not too sure why this is not working. But we'll have a look now. And with the Richat structure, as I mentioned, you see this great scar on the land, and all this water is very visible as it kind of runs out to the ocean. So we'll see the Richat structure. And I mean, even here, with Africa itself, you can kind of see this channel of something that has completely warped and shaped the land, rushing into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, let me just point out the Richat here. And as I mentioned, extremely, extremely, extremely interesting. Now, we're not going to spend too much time on that. I highly recommend you check it out. What I wanted to just point out was the kind of gash you see here, and how that gash sort of runs with the rest of this runoff. I mean, look at how much water must have passed against these rocks to then run into the ocean and creates incredible ripples. You see this in different parts of the world. Now, the reason this is important to us is because again, we're talking about cycles and mass extinctions and huge changes to the earth. If things like this happened, you would scarcely find our civilization. If this happened to us, it would be very, very difficult. And slapchippies, yes, this floods have more than one have happened in the past. So I'm not too exactly sure which one did this, but Randall Colson talks about the Younger Dryas. And the Younger Dryas was one of the last ice ages we had. Now, the Younger Dryas was affected by what he calls meltwater pulse B1. And so that was, a very specific name given to the impact crater on with multiple impact craters in the northern hemisphere that hit ice shelves. And so basically, if you take a glass of water and you put ice in the water, if the ice melts and the water rises at the same time because of its displacement characteristics, the water always stays level. But if the water is locked on land and is not already in the ocean displacing that, the moment it melts because of some kind of huge impact crater or possibly a volcano, that water gets released and just rolls across the land as a giant mudslide, basically. A mud tidal wave, as it were. And so, yes, there have been many previous floods, and the Younger Dryas was the last one that we are now studying quite intensely. And Randall Colson is, again, one of the huge champions of this theory here. And I just want to point this out here so you can kind of have a good look. You can see that here's the Younger Dryas, a huge drop in the temperature, one of the coldest temperatures that we've had. And we think that it's very strange that the temperatures were rising, and then suddenly you just had this drop, and we think that that's, one of the mass extinctions that happened. Now, remember, it's not just a flood. The flood means changes in the weather, changes in the streams, the Gulf streams, possibly the magnetic poles of the Earth. Everything gets affected. So we can see all kinds of evidence in the geological record of Earth, not only of cataclysm, but possibly of previous civilizations. And that's the whole Silurian hypothesis we were talking about earlier. So, not only can we look backwards in the records and see how the Earth can be affected to, or how it affected man, but some have even looked or tried to look forward in time. Because if you know the processes of how things work, like tectonic events, like, what was that guy's name? He was an interesting, I don't know if I got it in my notes here. Yes, that's right. Jim Birkeland. Let's call him up. Jim Birkeland was an interesting fellow. He was in the 80s. A weather... He worked for the he worked for the weather authorities of certain news agencies, and obviously was part of the scientific community and all of that. And he had this interesting thing where he was able to predict earthquakes, and it's a bit terrifying in a certain sense, because he posed, okay, so he got some things wrong, but he has frequently been right. And I mean, how often is a person right about predicting an earthquake? And one of the most famous ones he predicted was the World Series quake. And that's actually crazy, right? Because it's during the World Series, which for those of you not from America, it's baseball. It's like the World Cup of baseball for the clubs in America that play baseball. I think I got that right. And the World Series quake happened during this massive televised baseball game. So I'm sure we'll catch a video of it here. And as I say, this was predicted by Jim Berkland a couple of days before. And it was put on the radio. And we're going to look at how he came across this incredible ability to predict such changes in the Earth itself. And we'll see here as we get into it, that's where the mystery starts to pop out as we dive deep. So I think this one was one of the cool ones. Let's have a good listen here. Make sure I'm not blowing your eardrums.
Zoom into Candlestick Park in the southeastern corner of the city. For the first time in 27 years, a World Series game will be played in Candlestick Park. The Battle of the Bay continues.
Okay, we're just going to jump forward. Bottom on the fourth. 1989 World Series. Okay, watch this. So, normal game. Everyone's having a good time. And there you go. The transmission just ends. Bizarre, isn't it? So, Jim Berkland was able to predict these quakes. And many asked him, Jim, how is this even possible? I mean, what are you, a savant or crazy person? He's like, no, I'm a weatherman. It's my thing. But he had a bit more of an open mind. And for example, he got a lot of criticism and a lot of flack because there was, in his analysis, things that the mainstream would not accept. For example, he said when there is, or just before there is, a big earthquake, for example, he worked for the US Geological Survey, he says, oh, sorry, my apologies, that's completely wrong. I think he was just a good old weatherman. But he was saying that one thing is he looks at the moon. So the moon creates tidal forces and gravitational pull on the Earth, and that will affect the pressure for certain quakes on certain faults. But not just the moon. Magnetic fields are important. Not just of the moon, but of certain planets, which was quite controversial. It sounds like astronomy mixed with a bit of astrology, right? It's you can see why he was sort of shunned a little bit. But then he even went further and said, the other thing I look at are the animals. The animals are sensitive to the deep changes and communication coming from the Earth. And they start to act strangely, and migrating birds and dogs and cats and all kinds of animals start to change their behavior a little bit. And so he notes these things and is able to say quite a few times with great accuracy, like even in 1994, he predicted the Northridge event, and then a couple of years later, one in Seattle. I mean, they basically came to him and said, stop predicting earthquakes because you're causing panic in the public. So not that hey, good job, you're able to help us know when to prepare with good, I mean, if you're getting it right, you know, even half the time, that's how many lives you're going to save, you know? I mean, it's not convenience, it's bordering on like being a bit of a pain in the bum, but hey man, 1 out of 2 times, if it's going to be a real earthquake, like you want to be ready, you know, with some days in advance. But instead of telling him he's done a good job and studying how he comes to these predictions, instead, he's crazy, stop predicting, pushed away. And that's good old Jim Birkeland. Let's pull up his wiki. So, yeah, as I said, they've studied a lot of his methodologies and things like that. And because it has these interesting aspects to it, like the orientation of not only the sun and the moon, but the other big planets like the gas giants. Not only their alignment, but their angular orientation to us also says a thing. And what's interesting is the angles, 90 degrees and 180 degrees, are quite important in astrology, I'm told. Yes. I believe that's called a square and opposition, something like that. But if the orientation is of 60 or 120 degrees, that harmonic, let's call it, seems to have the sun be a bit more chill, and therefore also creates a little bit more of a calm state on the Earth's, I mean, not just from the sun, but from all these orientations of planets and stuff. It creates a much more calm kind of period on the planet. So, what I'm trying to get here is that, you know, when you go to people like Jim Birkeland, he is able to look forward in time and make predictions about possible cataclysms, hopefully to help us, right? Now, this theme is not limited to Jim and earthquakes, but many other people have also made really strong attempts at trying to give us forewarning. Now, I will admit, some of these people are absolute kooks and you know, people that just, anyone can make a prediction and then explain why their prediction didn't come true. You know, Nostradamus also spoke in riddles, so, you know, when the big lion kills the small lion, and then, oh, that must mean, you know, that king, because he was known as Lionheart, so, oh, that must be the lion we're talking about. Well, he was slain in battle by a younger military commander whilst they were play jousting. Anyway, so that, well, it wasn't very play jousting, I guess. But instead of riddles, other people try and do analysis with science, with maths, with many other means, but they try and look forward in time. One of these people, one of the earliest ones that I can think of, is good old Isaac Newton. So Isaac Newton tried to predict when the Earth would end. I'm not too sure how he based his science. In fact, let's actually look at that together, because that's interesting. I just remember it vaguely. So it says here, in 1704, Newton said he believed that the world would end in 2060, leaving us with just 37 years to get our house in order, according to a report in the Daily Star. So that's the Daily Star. I don't know how much I'm gonna put into that one. I was hoping for more of a Wikipedia type article. But anyways, you'll, if you haven't got it lined up, but if you dabble and do your research, you'll see that indeed Newton did put this date down in 2060. And what was interesting is that not only does does he try and put down this very precise date of 2060 when there would be the end of, not the world in the sense, I mean, obviously the Earth would continue to go forward. But he tried to use the concepts that he had to get a very specific date using basically systems theory, complex systems theory. And, you know, he's not the only one to try and think forward about what kind of dangers we would find in the future. You know, he's just one of them. But one of the other really big institutions that are doing it in modern day terms, you know, just sticking onto the science and using hard data in a complex systems approach, it's very interesting that MIT was also involved in the 1970s trying to create simulations, and they would use, you know, different variables, things like population, agriculture, political stability, non-renewable resources, industry capabilities. You know, they would put all of this into a machine and start simulating things so that they could try and figure out what would be the best things that humanity could adjust most immediately to try and hold together the balance of nature and man, and man's insatiable need, obviously, for pure capitalism. It's terrible, but, you know, MIT, yes, when they predicted the end of the world, well, it was just 20 years short of Newton. Newton predicted in 2060, and the MIT study, they basically said 2040. And what was interesting is they said that it would be progressional. So it actually starts 20 years prior to that, which puts us at 2020. So their best models kept bombing out for society and civilization and the forward movement of humanity through time. And it all seems to collapse somewhere around 2040, 2060. And they speculate that it comes a little bit sooner. Now, whether you're looking at it through the system dynamics of Forrester, or you're looking at it through the maths of Isaac Newton, or whatever model you can kind of come up with, some of these models end up being a little bit doomsday, a little bit Armageddon, a little bit end of the world, so to speak. And that's all fine and well if, again, you're trying to inform us and it's a legitimate attempt at trying to bring truth to the public. But at the same time, some of the more nefarious groups, like the Club of Rome, they've also done their own studies. And they call this the doomsday model. So you can immediately see from the outset that they're not just talking about climate cycles or things like that. No. They're straight into the Armageddon aspect. And I mention this in many story times because if you're departing straight from some kind of concept that at the end there will be an inevitable reckoning and fire and brimstone, and it's blinkers. Life is different, the world has gone through incredible different changes, and we leave nothing off the table. So having one view as the only way that the universe will unfold in the future is a very rough bet, and one I wouldn't make. So when these people like the Club of Rome, who are part of like, the round council of the round table. So that's the Committee of 300, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergs, the deep state, the evil oligarchs. Some would even call them the Illuminati, these rich and powerful organizations that look for one world government. And in a sense, it's true. I mean, the conspiracy comes from very sharp grains of truth. And, if you look at the Club of Rome, firstly, it's very shady. It comes from Morgenthau Group, and it's like secret meeting, and some of its members, like Aurelio Peccei, he was one of its creators. One of their aims was for peace and stability through ultimate control by a one world authority, a new world order in a certain sense. And, that was kind of the view of the Club of Rome. So when they do this doomsday model simulation about the end of the world, they're doing this not just to inform the public. No, they're doing this to inform their investors and their higher-ups where to go build their bunkers so that they might survive, and the rest of the world, can just fend for themselves. That's why you see all these rich people building bunkers in places like New Zealand and Switzerland, and it's all secret, and it's all hush-hush, and they know something that they don't want you to know, and that's obscene to me. If you're going to say that there's going to be danger, bring forward your best argument. Let's test it, and then let's see if we can do something about it. Don't just leave the world to, come what may, see what happens at the end of days. It's really terrible. Now, one thing I quickly want to mention here, because we spoke about good old Edgar Cayce in the previous episode. Edgar Cayce was known as the Sleeping Prophet. He was this American Christian Sunday school teacher who basically had these incredible visions and was able to do readings, and he also was able to look at things both in the past and in the future. And Cayce had a few predictions about the big changes that the Earth would come across, great catastrophe, as it were. And, it was incredible that not only his readings about Atlantis being completely destroyed, but he also spoke about other things like pole shifts. Now, what's interesting is that Atlantis was not destroyed by a pole shift, but Cayce reckons it was by an internal war, by the Atlanteans, the sons of Belial, and basically another island of Mu, or Lemuria. And there are concepts for the use of the two-eye and the very powerful technologies. They led to some kind of a disagreement, and conflict ensued, and the Earth was destroyed. So who knows if that was one of those Paleo-Eocene, Eocene thermal maximums, or one of the Eocene layers of mysterious origin that we start to trace going back millions of years ago. Again, that's the Cyrillian hypothesis telling us that maybe something like this could have happened long ago. But for Atlantis and Mu, we don't actually have to look that far back. As we mentioned previous, Slapchippies brought up the question of floods, and we mentioned the Younger Dryas. That was conveniently, as the Bible kind of put it, and every other culture on this earth. I mean, I must have read at least 50 different origin stories from different parts of the world that all talk about a flood. Again, there's been more than one, but the last one that humanity can remember was more or less the biblical one around the Younger Dryas. And as we start to move away from the Cyrillian thing, looking back millions of years ago, we can see a little bit closer that there has been some kind of human destruction, and that kind of destruction can be just ahead of us. So looking very close in our history, we can see that not only may have there been very big changes to society. In fact, one thing that blows my mind. Here's something I'm going to try and link for you. It's going to be a little bit difficult, but I'll do my best. One thing I wanted to just mention is this kind of destruction that we're seeing more closely. The closer you come to the modern day, the more you will be able to actually see ancient structures, and you won't have to start looking at the isotopes and things from really, really far back. As you get closer, there's more evidence that pops up. And one thing that really blew my mind is if you go to Tanis in Egypt, it's a surreal place. I've never been there, but I've looked at like probably every picture that is and video that I could get my hands on. And the amazing thing with places like Tanis is that you will find great destruction. And it's not the kind of destruction that you will see very easily unless you start to put it all together. In other words, if you up close, you just see a bit of a statue here and a piece of a column there. But as you start to approach these things, you begin to see that some of the statues have literally been burnt and blown away, like they've been blocks, that have been swatted by some kind of incredible destruction. Now, I'm mentioning Tanis because let's actually bring up some photos. I want to bring up that burned statues. This is really Here we go. Okay, so let's bring it up on screen for you. Now, as I mentioned, in Tanis, you find things like, you can see here this. Oh goodness, sorry. I've taken that off screen. Let me bring that back on screen for you. Sorry, there we go. So you can see from this statue here that a part of it, that's not erosion or something. That is a scorch mark of incredible heat, because that's an really hard stone. So to get that kind of burn on it, who knows, a solar flare, a nuke, only something like that would be really catastrophic could do something like this. And the way the pieces are scattered about, as I mentioned, in Tanis, not only is that statue just absolutely burnt, but you'll see strewn about just pieces of everything. And these statues are massive. They are multiple tons. And what does this to these statues is a great mystery. And the scorch marks and things like that are just incredible. So here's, this column basically looks like it sort of fell over, but I encourage you to check it out, because it is absolutely fascinating to have seen something of, here's perhaps an older picture, but one that really shows the magnitude of just these really big blocks and statues just absolutely decimated and then covered by the sands of time. So you can see here in this old photo of the ruins. Now, again, as you get closer, you start to see that some things were man-made, some things were natural. Something like the flash flooding of the mammoths, of the woolly mammoths. Oh, sorry, no, I said flash flooding, I meant flash freezing. The flash freezing of the mammoths is must have been an incredible natural event when there was some kind of a cataclysm, because it's difficult to freeze a steak when you put it in your freezer. To instantly freeze something, you have to like dip it in liquid nitrogen or something like that. But in the past, we've had these mammoths that have been found with food still in their mouths. They're still eating like the buttercups, basically. And what's interesting is that they too have been blown away because their legs have basically snapped at the ankle. It's like, if they were in ice or something, whatever just wave came across just absolutely tore them apart. And there was this incredible freezing effect, which is something you would see from maybe a meteor impact or some other kind of massive cataclysm. So let me just see if I can bring you some video here. It's pretty cute. Here we go. Well, okay, it's not video, it's images. But here you can see Yucca. And you can see that Yucca is missing some of her legs. And you can see in her mouth is still plant material. And she's not the only one. Many mammoths have been found flash frozen in the ice. And so think about what must have happened to create that kind of a destructive force. Now, as I mentioned, looking at our time now and seeing this kind of destruction, we can get an idea of what maybe awaits us in the future. Because there are these different cycles, and you can pick whatever cycle you like. One of my personal favorites, for example, is the Kali Yuga. That, if you enjoy the Hindu cosmology, they talk about the different yugas as the ages through which life goes through which consciousness develops. So you bring that up on screen for you because it's super interesting. These are the yuga cycles. And you can see here that there are 4 yugas: Krita, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali. Now, Kali Yuga is the one we're currently in, and each one represents a different part of the wheel of the Dharma, of the cycle of life. And each one represents a certain level of our basically development, of our cosmic and spiritual developments. Now, what's really interesting about this is that we are currently in Kali Yuga. Now, when we're talking about these cycles, we're not talking about like 10 year, 1500. We're talking about 1,200 divine years of that comes after the Kali Yuga. In total, the Kali Yuga basically is now 2023. There you go. Kali Yuga began 5,124 years ago and has 426,876 years left as of 2023. So we're in the Kali Yuga, and as you can see, it ends quite far from now. Near the end of the Kali Yuga, virtues are at their worst. A cataclysm and re-establishment of the Dharma will occur. In the next cycle, Krita, which is the cycle that follows. Now, whether you look at the Kali Yuga, whether you look at celestial procession, whether you look at the Maya, these cultures across the world have gone to incredible lengths to tell us that they've had great cataclysm. And I think one of the documents that best tells us about these cycles and how serious it is to the doomsday people of MIT and the Club of Rome. All of these people see the cycle as something that they need to know about, and we're not smart enough to kind of follow. But whatever their simulations are, for example, one thing I remember is the limits of growth. So the limits of growth, again, is the 1972 publication by the Club of Rome that basically said, with all the variables that we have, the models are going to basically end in, some kind of doomsday event. And so the thing that will most quickly rectify the problem is basically reducing economic and population growth as much as possible. Because they say the system cannot support it. So literally, deindustrialize and depopulate is the theme in the limits of growth. So you can see why they're seen as crazy sociopathic eugenicists in a certain sense. But again, what I really want to focus on here is these simulations that the Club of Rome will do, and MIT and the Brookings Institute and all of them. What they're really trying to do is, again, simulate where humanity not only where humanity has come from, but where humanity will go to. And then they seek to somehow control that. And that's where we're going to begin to wrap up this episode. But I want to talk to you guys about Chan Thomas, because in the CIA vault, one of my favorite documents you'll find there is the story of Adam and Eve, written by Dr. Chan Thomas. Now, what's super interesting about the Adam and Eve story is we've looked at this in previous story times. Let me bring it up on screen for you. This is the declassified version. It was declassified only in 2013. There we go. So it was declassified in 2013 and written in the 60s, if I remember correctly. And this, okay, you can ignore the beginning articles, but here we go. The Adam and Eve story by Chan Thomas. Now, let me just explain something here about the predictions that Chan Thomas is making here, because this gives you a good idea of how he looks back and uses the ancient texts and the science to try and himself say, this is a real thing, the government is aware of it, it's in the ancient texts, and this is what we are likely to face. And again, like Jim Birkeland had been told not to report anymore on his quake predictions, this could be a similar thing where the government was perhaps afraid that, or perhaps afraid of the impacts that this information would have on society, and perhaps this is why the book was suppressed. I mean, you could find the book in its hardcover, but it was difficult. Many copies just never found their way to the general public. And as I said, you can see this was declassified and sanitized in 2013. And this is great. It's only a couple of pages long, so it's not too big. There is a myth that apparently there's a much longer version of a few 100 or 200 pages, but this is enough to kind of get the point across. Because firstly, let me just tell you a little bit about Chan Thomas, because now that we've gone through the aerospace link to secret societies and ancient archaeological dig sites, you see it come around again here. Because Chan Thomas was not only a scientist and an engineer, but he was a scientist and engineer for McDonnell Douglas. And what's interesting is, the year that the McDonnell Douglas project of 1966 was, studying UFOs and anti-gravity, that's when that gets classified, and he's obviously working for McDonnell Douglas, and so Adam and Eve gets classified as well. It's very fascinating. I mean, some say that that's perhaps the reason that this story was suppressed, but who knows? Now, what's interesting in this Adam and Eve story, and as I said, I'm not going to read the whole 57 pages to you, but I'm going to read a few things. Firstly, we have to maybe go a little bit further back here. There is a part from the Timaeus, which was written by Plato. And Plato's great uncle, Solon, he went to Egypt and spoke to the high priests of Egypt at the time. So, in other words, this is where some of Chan Thomas's information comes from, talking about Atlantis as a civilization that we last were able to record as being technologically advanced, and what might have happened to them. And then the first humans that survived that were basically the story of Adam and Eve, the first men that you and I know today as modern humans. And let's have a quick read here, because here is the Egyptian priest telling Solon. So now Plato's recounting the story, because Solon came many, many years before Plato. But Plato was very good at writing everything. In fact, we wouldn't know half of Socrates if Plato hadn't written it. So he says here, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are but children." So this is the Hellenic culture, the Greeks. "There is no old doctrine handed down among you by the ancient tradition, nor any science which is horary with the age. And I will tell you the reason behind this. There have been, and there will be again, many destructions of mankind, arising out of many causes. The greatest having been brought about by the earth fire and inundation." Inundation is basically the floods, right? "Whatever happened either in your country or ours, or in any other country which we are informed of, any action which is noble and great, or in any other way remarkable which has taken place, all has been inscribed long ago in our temple records, whereas you and other nations did not keep imperishable records. And then, after a period of time, the usual inundation visits, like a pestilence, and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education. And thus you have to begin over again as children, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either amongst us or yourselves." So what the priest tells him there is that you haven't kept imperishable records. This is why the pyramid is such a great structure to survive all kinds of cataclysm. This is why the Sumerians perhaps chose to write with tablets, even though they might have had access to other writing materials. Stone and clay and these kinds of minerals keep for thousands of years, as opposed to what we jot down now. I mean, even if we keep digital information, it's going to oxidize over time. So maybe, like the Atlanteans, we'll keep information in crystals, because those will last hundreds of thousands of years. So I'm just going to finish off here, and he says, "As for those genealogies of yours, which you have related to us," now this is again the Egyptian priest talking to Solon, the ancient Greek. He says, "They are to you no better than tales of children. For in the first place you remember only one deluge, and one only, whereas there were a former number of them. And in the next place there dwelt in your land, which you do not know, the fairest and noblest race of men that ever lived, of which you are a seed or remnant. And this was not known to you because for many generations the survivors of that destruction made no records. And remember here, he says that when the usual inundation visits like a pestilence, it leaves you and those who are destitute of letters and education. So basically you go back to the Stone Age, and thus you have to begin over again as children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either amongst yourself or others in other nations of the world. And this rings so true to us because, when we've looked at, for example, the doomsday cult of the continuation of government people, we see that they try and hide this information. If they know that there's going to be an asteroid hitting the Earth, they inform the president and his family, and they smuggle off everyone that they think is necessary for the continuation of government. And then maybe at the last moment they'll tell the public. And by then it might just be absolutely too late. Because if you tell the public first and there's chaos, then you can't... Well, the theory is that they put forward is that you can't evacuate the people that you need for your deep military underground bunkers to survive catastrophic cataclysm or some kind of decapitation strike or something. But the point of this is simply that you see here in the Timaeus that Solon and the ancient Egyptian high priest are talking openly, and the high priest is saying, you don't realize that this has happened many times, and you come from some of the noblest races, because when the deluge came and inundated them, you were left without language or records, and so you can't remember but a few thousand years ago. And so that's fascinating to keep in mind, because again here he's also saying that there are cycles. It returns like a pestilence. And this is the basic story in Adam and Eve by Chan Thomas. He says here, for example, to give you a sense of the kind of destruction that he sees when these poles shift, because according to Chan Thomas, it's a pole shift, but a pole shift that might also be connected to solar maximums, which we're currently in, right? The solar maximum we're in at the moment ends in 2025. So we're at the height of intensity for solar activity. And this has a deep, deep, deep impact and effect on the Earth. So in this article, or this book, I should say, Chan Thomas starts like this. He says, with a rumble so low as to be inaudible, growling, throbbling, and then fuming into a thundering roar, the earthquake starts. It is not like any earthquake in recorded history. In California, the mountains will shake like ferns in a breeze. The mighty Pacific rears back and piles up into the mountain of water more than 2 miles high, and then starts its race eastward. With a force of 1,000 armies, the wind attacks, ripping, shredding, and destroying everything in its supersonic bombardment. The unbelievable mountain of Pacific seawater follows with the wind eastward, bearing Los Angeles and San Francisco as if they were but grains of sand. Nothing stops the relentless, overwhelming onslaught of the wind and the ocean. Across the continent, the 1,000-mile-per-hour winds wreaks its unholy vengeance everywhere, mercilessly, unceasingly. Every living thing is ripped into shreds while being blown across the countryside, and the earthquake leaves no place untouched. In many places, the Earth's molten sublayer breaks and spreads a sea of white-hot liquid fire to add to the Holocaust. Within 3 hours, the fantastic wall of water moves across the continent, burying the wind-ravaged lands under 2 miles of seething water coast to coast. In a fraction of a day, all vestiges of civilization are gone, and the great cities, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Chicago, Dallas, New York, are nothing but legends. Barely a stone is left where millions walked just a few hours before. A few lucky ones who are able to manage to find shelter from the screaming wind or the lee side of were on the lee side of Pike's Peak, and watched the sea of molten fire break through the quaking valleys below. The raging waters follow, piling higher and higher, steaming over the molten earth fire, and rising almost to their feet. Only great mountains such as this can withstand the cataclysmic onslaught. So you can see, for example, he's talking a lot about the American continent because he's an American, but he also says the South American finds the Andes not high enough to stop the cataclysmic violence pounded out by the nature in her berserker rage. He says Europe cannot escape the onslaught. The raging Atlantic piles higher and higher upon itself, following the screeching wind eastward. West Africa and the sands of the Sahara vanish in nature's wrath. Eastern Siberia and the Orient suffer a strange fate indeed, as a giant subterranean scythe sweeps away the earth's foundations, accompanied by the winds. And they say that, for example, a great rift will appear in Africa, dividing it up into sort of 3 pieces. Most of Europe will just become pieces of island. A big joining of the Baltic and the various seas around the Caspian and thereby Russia will join up, kind of severing Russia a little bit more geologically by a big sea between itself and Europe. But for example, here's an interesting thing. Edgar Cayce did a reading where, he also spoke about these kinds of destructions. So it's funny that we're reading it here in Chan Thomas, but it's super fascinating to me as well that Edgar Cayce, also mentioned that that Russia would be one of the Russia and Africa, would be one of the hopes of the earth for the future. On the one hand, for freedom, I'll explain that in a more precise sense, in a different sense, because it's not to do with communism or politics or things like that. He talks more about a cultural and spiritual revolution, but not revolution in a Bolshevik or communist sense. It's more like a personal freeing of the people, but also that they will be able to supply the rest of the world with food in these times of crisis. Let's see if I can pull up the quotes. Because what's really great is that all of the readings by Edgar Cayce, if you go to the Cayce Foundation website, they are numbered and ordered, by world events and by medicine and by, whatever subjects you can kind of want. And so he has quite a few readings, but so not that many readings that are on world events of the future. But when he did start going on about the prophecies of these world-changing events, he did say that both Russia and Africa would be the hopes of trying to feed the world after the cataclysms. So it's very interesting. We hope that, obviously cataclysms don't befall us, but at the same time, it's something that we do take quite seriously. I'm laughing because I was thinking about, CNN. They've got this thing. They have this video which they claim they will play at the time of Armageddon. Let me get the article for you. It's absolutely ridiculous. I've gotten here's the Guardian reporting on a CNN article. Let me bring it up on screen and blow it up for you guys so you can see what I'm talking about. But they say, here we go, the apocalypse will be live. CNN's mythical end of the world video is real. And I mean, there's nothing majorly amazing about it. It's basically just a band playing, what is the song? We're gonna go on air and we're going to stay on until the end of the world. And when that time comes, we'll cover it and play nearer my God to thee and sign off. And this is what basically they will apparently play. Hopefully a better, a better quality version, but let's have a little listen. Yeah, that's enough of that. Anyway, so good old CNN. Whole concept of apocalypse and the world changing. You know, many humans might not make it, whatever big event happens. You know, we've seen terrible earthquakes and all kinds of natural events, and there are those that also originate outside of the planet. Coronal mass ejections, meteors, things like that. So in this Chan Thomas article, as I mentioned, he will go into how also Antarctica and Greenland with their ice caps will now rotate around the Earth in the torrid zone. And once the oceans start to settle, things like Antarctica will suddenly become green. You know, it's very, very interesting. Now, you can read about all of this because he puts forward interesting interesting links, but a lot of them go back to ancient texts and prophecies. And I find that super interesting because, you know, when we talk about things like Atlantis or whatever the case is, we're really dealing with some kind of a memory that humanity remembers of something that absolutely destroyed us, and we have only oral tradition that has seemed to have kept that up, and a couple of tales here and there. The Epic of Gilgamesh and a lot of the texts that come from the Indus culture, they also have survived, writing a lot of that stuff down. But many other places of the world, it's all legend and myth that has come down through oral traditions. So where I want to go with this now is just when we're thinking of Atlantis, you know, it's supposed to be this giant continent that sunk below the ocean during this incredible turmoil. Now, as I mentioned, Casey said they basically blew themselves up and changed the whole world in a way that both Atlantis and Mu were never to be seen again. And whilst, you know, it's difficult to kind of believe in these things, there are little grains that we have to really take into consideration. There are pieces of the puzzle that fit too nicely to not be considered. It would be a shame to take them off the table, so to speak. Now, this mythical continent, Mu, okay, it's supposed to be here, between Asia and America, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. And what I find incredibly interesting about this particular legend, let's call it a legend, you know? This particular legend, as strange as it is, has called forward a lot of really respectable people over the years to start looking more carefully at this possibility, because there are some things that you can't easily dismiss. You will note, for example, that some people call this land Lemuria. And what's fascinating about this is that some of the people have brought across the concepts of Mu, the ancient lost continent. They were also incredibly deep spiritualists, in the sense that they were involved in mystical schools, the secret schools, as it were. You will see this in not a better way than through good old Augustus Le Plongeon. He was a British American archaeologist, and obviously he's got this French surname, but he spent most of his time in North and South America. And it's to him that we owe a lot of the early discoveries about the Maya and the Olmec cultures. And he was one of the people that kind of went on about Mayanism, and he took many travels to Peru with his wife, Alice Dixon, who, strangely enough, was one of the most, I'm going to say, one of the most prominent women of her time. You know, she started one of the first recognized women's club, and did amazing photography of relics and geographical and geological discoveries. So she went everywhere and found incredible pyramids and sculptures and potteries, and got those all detailed. So let me give you a picture of this guy because it's super interesting. And when I say he's part of good old the good old mystical schools, I'm not joking to you. So Augustus Le Plongeon. Let's do a little Google search. Here we go. Let's pull up some images. Oh, here we go. And immediately you can see here today in Masonic history, and the striking photo of him. You can see him in his good old Masonic outfit there. You can see the compass and the square. And, he was a Freemason. And Alice Dixon, she was into Rosicrucianism and spiritualism. And then, of course, Augustus Le Plongeon also had another accomplice with his theory about the lost continents of Mu, and that comes from James Churchward. And James Churchward, here he is here. He also is quite famous for his tales of Lemuria and Atlantis. And we were saying that this island called Mu, whilst a lot of these people have been discredited as pseudoscientists and, rambling madmen, not to be listened to, over the years, little bits and pieces have come forward. Because if we go back to this map here, and remember this place was once called Lemuria, it explains, for example, why you have things like lemurs on the Indian side and on the opposite side across the Pacific. So the Americans, the Asian side, the Australian side, and part of South America all have these links with lemurs, and it's impossible because these lemurs, they're not like birds that can just fly, and in these cases there were no land bridges. So how did lemurs genetically get across onto these continents? Now, this would be possible if there was perhaps a giant landmass that was there, and when ocean levels were much lower, you would find these kinds of animals being able to more easily travel across. It would also explain how you would see the same kind of language. Remember that there are Greek elements in Polynesian, in Pali, and Pali is where the ancient Indus language comes from, the Proto-Indian language elements come from. And so it's interesting, how does that language come across that giant, vast ocean? And not only that, but the incredibly shared cultures. pyramid building, language, and all these things. It would make a lot more sense if these little islands, for example, like Easter Island, if you look at the language, symbols, if you look at the kind of belief system they had, the moai that they placed in the ground. I mean, it's amazing. It's amazing because they were able to, in this little island, apparently like 12,000 people came and carved this volcanic rock that's super, super hard. And then, either they were buried or they were left standing and some cataclysm buried them. It's quite interesting. And the way their fingers wrap around reminds me a lot of some of the things in Göbekli Tepe. So these are some of the statues. Let's check the pillar. Yeah, here we go. This is a good photo. Excellent. So you can see here that also, like the moai, they also have this pillar-like shape and these fingers that wrap around, just that with the moai, many of them are covered. So it's interesting that these are thousands and thousands of years old. And how does that information go from Easter Island in the middle of the Pacific to some place like Turkey and Göbekli Tepe? Again, we have to consider this possibility of a continent like Lemuria or Atlantis, because we've seen tectonic shifting. And not only that, when we look at things like Casey's prediction of the Bimini Road as part of the old Atlantean land being risen up, in fact, when we start to look in those kinds of places, we are discovering incredible structures buried beneath the ocean. So here's the Bimini Road. Let me pull it up on screen for you, just a few photos so you can kind of get an idea. And you can see here, just immediately, some divers checking these man-made roads. And remember, there's also an ancient legend of a road between Pakistan and Sri Lanka. An ancient tale of a prince that builds this bridge to go rescue his princess, his lover, or something like that. And in fact, now if you look at the archaeological, I suppose is it still archaeological if it's underwater? Maybe there's a more interesting or precise name for that. But basically, the archaeological records show that things like the Bimini Road, and even on the other end near Sri Lanka and Pakistan and India, there are structures under the water. And remember, we said that Mu goes all the way up to Japan, which is, one of the eastern sides. And what we find in Japan is Yonaguni. Yonaguni is also incredible because it's got these structures under the water. And, like these steps are big and these cuts are very precise. And so if you did have a continent called Lemuria, it would explain all these things. It would explain why the language was able to travel, why the animals and the culture was shared amongst these different continents that we thought were divided by oceans. And we again see these pieces of land here and there beginning to show themselves a little bit more. And we're also discovering some of the others. So Casey predicted some of the stuff, and here we are. Bimini Road is a real thing, and Yonaguni is a real thing. And so what was once pseudoscience perhaps is not as pseudoscience as we might have thought. Now, of course, anyone that's part of a secret society and claims they know the truth, and if you're part of their secret society, then they'll tell you, that's a red flag for me. And that's why I mention often that deep knowledge, like our ancient story or the possibility of intelligent life on other planets and things like that, it gets suppressed by secret societies, militaries, intelligence services, governments. They're worried about the shock these kinds of things would cause. And I mean, literally, if you don't believe me, let's have a look at... here we go. Here we go. So, the Brookings Institute had done well, they were tasked by NASA. Okay, this is like early 1958, if I'm not mistaken. So no, early 1958, the Brookings Institute gets a request from NASA to do a study looking at the cultural impact of space exploration. and it's very interesting what they found here. So let me bring this up here. Well, firstly, let me show you the cover in color. I've only got the cover in color, unfortunately. So here is the proposed studies on the implications of peaceful space activities for human affairs. And this, again, was from the Brookings Institute, done for NASA. And what is super interesting about this is that here's the actual document here. And if you scroll down, what they sort of say, it's very milquetoast. It doesn't go too crazy, but there are certain sections that absolutely will blow your mind. And one of them is relating to how, you know, they say that it's quite likely that humans won't really stand a high chance at all of seeing intelligent life on other planets. But if they are trained in a certain sense, they might find traces of ancient civilizations on places like the Moon, Mars, and Venus. And we need to then have a study about what those cultural implications might be. And I kid you not, this is like 1958, during the time when also the military was doing Project Horizon, which was trying to put a base on the other far side of the moon. This is around that time. And I want to read you something very interesting that they write here, because it's only when you see it firsthand that it really just pops out at you. So let's have a look-see here. The Brookings proposed studies on the implications of peaceful space activities. Okay. Now, it's a very dry document. It's 250 pages, and it is very, very, very dry. I'm not going to lie. So I'll pick out a few points that are super interesting, just to give you a sense of if you can stomach a little bit of pain and torture from 250 pages of dry document, you might get these little gems here. So one of the quotes from the report: while face-to-face meetings with, in this case we assume extraterrestrials, would not occur within the next 20 years or so, and note that this is like in the 60s, 70s now that they're thinking, because this is written in the 50s, they say unless technology is more advanced than ours, qualifying a visit to Earth, if that's not a possibility, then what we would find instead are artifacts left at some point in time by these life forms, which might possibly be discovered through our space activities on the Moon, Mars, or Venus. Okay, so here is the section where they actually mention this. I'll pull up the page now for you, because it is quite fascinating. It's an historical record. It's always fun to it's always fun to have a look, right? And there it is there. So and there it is there. artifacts left at some point in time by these life forms might possibly be discovered throughout space activities on the Moon, Mars, or Venus. If there is any contact to be made during the next 20 years, it would be most likely by radio, which would indicate that these beings had at least equaled our own technological level. But they obviously look at this going forward. If the beings were more advanced than we were, they would say that would be a big problem. But again, they say it's highly, highly unlikely that we'll meet any beings. Instead, they say we must look at the anthropological file and the mineral file and the different ways of looking at things in the past. If we applied it to our Earth, we can also apply it to other planets, and we might find super interesting things there. Now, the other thing is that they write here, continuing studies to determine the emotional and intellectual understanding and attitudes and successive alterations of them, if any, regarding the possibility and consequences of discovering intelligent extraterrestrial life, should be gone forward with. So in other words, studying the emotional and intellectual attitudes and understanding that society will have, kind of picking these things up. They also say historical and empirical studies of the behavior of people and their leaders when confronted with dramatic and unfamiliar events or social pressures should be looked at. Such studies might help to provide programs for meeting and adjusting to the implications of such a discovery. In other words, they're talking about PSYOPs in 1958. How to adjust the public's narrative so that they are better adjusted to these implications. Think of all the movies that we've been bombarded with. Independence Day, 2001: A Space Odyssey. I mean, there's so many sci-fi stories that try and give us a visceral picture of what it must be like to discover an alien or fight intelligent life, or make an hyper-intelligent AI that takes us over. These things might be a part of this formation of narrative. They further say here, questions one might wish to answer by such studies would include: how might such information, under what circumstances, be presented to or withheld from the public, and for what ends? What might be the role of discovering scientists and other decision makers regarding the release of fact of discovery? Now, what's interesting here is that one of the things that the Brookings Institutes one of the things that they weren't so worried about were, oddly enough, the people who had religious orientations, or people that had a belief in some kind of extraterrestrial life. So whilst they say that there's no fundamental basis for that, these people are genuinely more happy and a little bit more adjusted and have a greater openness to information. So they seem to adjust a little bit better. They got better tools to deal with great phenomena, whether it's miracles or apparitions or just, again, if you're open to extraterrestrial life and you're that kind of a believer, it makes a bit more cognitive sense to you. However, what they are worried about, or the group of people that they're worried about, are A, the leaders of the world, and B, the scientists. So that I find incredibly interesting about this study. And they say that the Earth scientists would have a great problem, because forever science has been an incredible tool for humans to master nature and understand nature, and in some sense overcome whatever nature brings forward to us. Now, if there are these amazing discoveries of either life on another planet or archaeological discoveries of something that has been on these other worlds, it would do a huge damage, they say, psychologically to many scientists, because they say some scientists would be like, well, okay, well, what's the point of science? I mean, if there's something that's more advanced and, there's just going to be like mass cataclysm and, look at these other advanced civilizations that died out on these other planets, well, I might not pursue science and might just spend time with my friends and family and just pursue more personal things than, doing science. They also say that some scientists would find a great anger and anxiety and frustration no longer being able to fully grasp the scientific implications of these massive discoveries, and it might cause them incredible depression and anger and lashing out, as they say. And that makes sense to me. If you think you're so smart that you can understand anything, and then suddenly you come across ancient civilization or indications that there's been things before you that have been smarter than you in some way, because you see their footprints on different planets. I mean, you suddenly, as a scientist, I think, recoil at the fact that you're not at the top of mankind's knowledge, but you're a child trying to rebuild what had been previously lost. And they worry that scientists would have a problem with that. And then, of course, world leaders, because this would also create great skepticism, and people would not want to trust their leaders because, various reasons, and the leaders themselves would struggle to have control and instill some kind of order upon people, because people would just be like, well, the rules of the game have changed. There's new phenomena. There's new possibilities about the way the nature of reality can be configured. And so who's this politician like chirping in my ear about voting for him when the world is so much more magical and incredible than we could have ever known? So, like NASA basically hasn't made big splashes about this kind of study that they asked the Brookings Institute to do, but it was clear that right from the get-go they were interested and probing the implications of what we would find and how that would affect humankind. And it's not the first or the last time that they've done that. They keep, testing the waters, like religiously would, people spaz out, and, on a military level, what might happen and this is why I think a lot of the governments and mystery schools and the occult people, they've kept this information to themselves in a certain sense, because, again, they want to feel cool and know things that other people don't, and that makes them feel powerful, because with that information they might be able to survive a cataclysm and the rest of us scuttling ants might not. But also at the same time, there is a link that I'm trying to point out here between the archaeology and the records showing us the cycles that have forced the nature upon humans. So whether it's true polar wander, or whether it's a mass coronal ejection or an asteroid impact, whatever the case is, some of these things are cyclical. And the mystery schools have known this knowledge. And that's why, you'll find that people that are involved in the myth of Atlantis and Mu and that are all somehow involved in a mystery school or another. Because it's in the mystery schools that they try to preserve that ancient knowledge, because the masses, they don't trust the masses to know knowledge in its pure, blinding white light. At least that was for a long time. But then you did get some people like Blavatsky and Steinberg and all of these. So the Theosophical Society and others that tried to bring this knowledge back, because after the horrors of World War One, they were like, no, hold on. Keeping secrets is perhaps not the greatest idea. We should share the deep divine secrets of cosmic understanding. So that's where we start to get the occult overlapping with the ancient archaeology origins, overlapping with modern secrets, and then obviously the modern secrets of future cataclysm is where your continuation of government comes in the military, because that's an emergency threat. And you know how militaries love threats. Damn straight they do. So look, I mean, basically the Adam and Eve story spoke about this here with NASA talking about magnetic pole shifts. And, you know, it's funny that Casey also said that we would start to have pole shifts around the next big cycle. And he said it would happen in 1998. And in fact, NASA's first publication, if I'm not mistaken, started tracking that. And what's interesting is that we were updating our GPSs once every 5 years, and then once every 2 years, and once every year. Now we're updating our GPSs every 6 months because the magnetic poles are moving. And so we can see that the poles have flipped before, and we don't know what the full implications are of that, but it's a given. These things are real. And so you can kind of understand again why the CIA would suppress a story like Adam and Eve by Chan Thomas, because they think we're children and we don't know what to do with this information, or that the information might change the way we live, and that no longer gives them control over us. There's those two reasons that I think are worth noting. But as we start to wrap up this episode of StoryTime, of this incredible episode of StoryTime 24, we're looking again at the cycles and the cataclysms and the origins, because that is not only where we've been and where we are, but kind of where we're going. And I don't mean to blackpill everybody and say, you know, NASA's been studying this, and here's another great document that you can definitely find on the internet. This is also talking about, let me pull it up on the screen. There we go. This is Archaeology, Anthropology, and Interstellar Communication, also a NASA Aeronautics and Space Administration publication. Now, what's interesting about this, it's also very long. Oh goodness, it's very voluminous. It's 330 pages. So again, I'm not going to go into it. But again here, just look at some of the wording you'll see here. Reconstructing distant civilizations and encountering alien cultures. So basically what this is a publication by many authors, and each one does a topic. And one of the topics, again, distant civilizations and encountering alien cultures. It's not the first time that NASA's been thinking about this. And when they talk about the role of anthropology and the role of archaeology, what they're basically saying is that we can hunt for extraterrestrial life in ways that we didn't think possible previously. And we can look at our planet as an example of some of the things that would explain, for example, if Atlantis and Mu, or whatever ancient civilizations existed in the past, had been destroyed, what things would we be looking for? What communication would they leave for us? And they really go deep into this. You know, for example, how they also say, how do we present ourselves and pass our information into the solar system? How should we introduce our race of humanity to extraterrestrials if we ever met them? How would we communicate with them? How would they be communicating with us? What kind of messages would they leave over time? And it's, as I said, a very voluminous document. So take your time to read it. But one thing that was super interesting to me was that they mention here in 1971, for 10 weeks during the summer of 1971, 20 physical scientists and engineers, all professors in various related disciplines at a college, or disciplines at colleges and universities around the country, gathered at Ames to conduct a design study for a system for detecting extraterrestrial intelligent life. This was known as Project Cyclops. So they talk about this, and what was interesting about Project Cyclops is that, while SETI looks for radio communications and things, Project Cyclops was looking at this with proper military technology and science, things like spectral analyzers and everything that was available to them, which was very, very important, because how Ames links very closely to NASA. And again, Ames and the Jet Propulsion Laboratories also have leaders and histories within them that go super sideways into the occult nature. It is unbelievable, but that's for another story time on another day. Most definitely, because it requires its own story time. But the other thing that the article, Archaeology, Anthropology, and Interstellar Communication, this NASA document, the other interesting thing that also jumped out at me was that they did a whole section on children, right? There's like a whole article about the concept about how space is embedded within the construct of people's knowledge, and if you start layering that knowledge very, very early with children, it allows them to have a different concept once they grow up. So these studies that they do go deep, because they're like, oh, how would this not only affect our leaders and our scientists, but how would it affect the children? And then how will those children be when they're graduating or voting? These are the kinds of concepts that these folk have really dived deep into. I'll see if I can find a good quote relating to that. But this is the point of the matter, right? Is that simply, when we look at the megaliths and the antediluvian races, we can see on Earth that the cycles of nature have been incredibly powerful. And if it's not the cycles of nature, we have possibly destroyed ourselves in the past. And so the same kinds of things you can apply to other planets. You can look at the planet geologically, at isotopes, at minerals, and concentrations of certain things like the Silurian hypothesis, or you can start to look, hopefully, for ancient ruins, technology, anthropology, writing, messages, whatever the case is. The interesting thing is that some of the stuff, as I said, is natural, and some of the stuff is not. And so an interesting article that I saw was one that was pertaining to a possible nuclear war that had happened on Mars. And I kid you not, this is like some proper science that they're, many in the mainstream would say pseudoscience, but everything we've spoken about this evening started off as pseudoscience and then turned out to be true. Remember our opening quotes that all great truths begin as blasphemy, because nobody believes you when you come up with something so radical. But over time, a lot of the stuff has been proven worthy of study and investigation. And so, if you think like, oh, well, evidence for, a nuclear apocalypse on on Mars is a far stretch, well, here's an article for you. This was at the 46th Lunar and Planetary Science Conference in 2015. And I'm not going to bore you because it is a science paper. It is literally hard science. There are things that you can go and peer review yourself. So it's published and presented, and so there's there's very interesting things, but the gist of it is that whilst the mainstream will say that there is some kind of a natural system that we don't understand within the geology of Mars that creates some kind of a nuclear effect that accounts for all of these radiogenic isotopes that they have been reading, the other alternative is that there's been nuclear explosions, anomalous explosion hypothesis is what they call it, and that these xenon isotopes could literally have come from some kind of incredible thermonuclear war or something. And what's really interesting is that the site, one of the sites, is not far from Cydonia. And here's another paper. I'll bring this one up for you. This is evidence of a massive thermonuclear explosion on Mars in the past, the Cydonia hypothesis and Fermi's paradox. And this was authored by John Brandenburg in April 2020. It's a conference paper, right? So this hasn't been peer reviewed, but again, it's interesting. He says that the explosions appear due to a very large fission-fusion device of similar design as seen on Earth. And he says that the largest being approximately 80 meters in radius, the explosions appear correlated with two of the sites possibly of which are possibly archaeological, and formed near the basis of the Cydonia, and form the basis of the Cydonia hypothesis. Now, Cydonia, if you don't remember, is the area where the face on Mars is visible, or it's not far from it. And some say that there's also other structures, perhaps pyramids, and, you know, and here we go. This is a good map here. You can see where they find the high readings of nuclear explosions and the wind, and they map all of this out, and it's not far from Cydonia. And we all know that something happened to Mars. It once had water, it once had an atmosphere, and something completely took it apart. In fact, good old Musk was saying we should drop a few more nukes and warm it up, and, you know, then it'll be habitable. But again, as I said, these are real scientific studies that look at all kinds of things. For example, here, the trinitite glass from the tests in Mexico. Basically, when a nuclear explosion happens in the desert, the sand fuses into these glass globules, and they have the same kind of things that they're picking up on the Martian surface. So, big questions to be asked there. There's Cydonia, and there's the face, and there's a possible pyramid. This was taken from the Viking reconnaissance orbiter. So it's fascinating because nature can end us, we can end us. It seems like the chips are absolutely stacked against us. But what I want to leave you with here, and the positive note that I want to start to just wrap up on, is simply the fact that we have a lot of good information going back as far as you want to go about the cycles of the Earth and the things that have, the eras that have come and gone. And, you know, if history doesn't repeat itself, it definitely rhymes. And so we should give these things some kind of credence, especially because a lot of them are based on cycles that are completely natural and measurable in a certain sense. It's actually really interesting that even astrology seems to have a scientific basis to it in some aspects. So we shouldn't just, you know, swash everything off the table and think to ourselves that we have no control over these events. Instead, we have to try and realize that our ancient forefathers were survivors of these events. We ourselves are survivors of these events, and they've given us good information about what could happen to us and the considerations that we should have about trying to preserve not only our culture, our history, and our knowledge, but our message to future generations. And so that explains why we sometimes see petroglyphs or megalithic structures, and why we have ancient tales that seem to tell the same story across all over the world. You know, it really is incredible. You know, so whether it's going to be a pole shift, which happens every few thousand years, I think we're a little bit overdue apparently, or whether it's going to be World War III. We can't always control the future, but the one thing that'll give us the best chance moving forward is always bringing forward information as the best truth for the greatest good of everyone, and let everybody partake in it. You know, unfortunately, with secret societies and militaries and governments, they keep these incredible secrets to themselves because they think we can't handle a negative truth, a truth that is true but damaging because it implies that things are going to get very, very rough. And so keep this in mind, that the government isn't going to tell you it, they're not going to tell it to you straight. Science doesn't always get it right. People aren't always aware. So what counters all of that is having a good knowledge for yourself, and always, in a certain sense, being prepared for what you can prepare for. I've said in previous story times, when we were talking about alien disclosure, I mentioned this point. I said, even if the aliens, let's call them ETs, whatever, are an advanced race that come here and absolutely take us over and enslave us and decimate us and, I don't know, destroy us all, it's a possibility, you know, I'm not going to rule it out. So what are our choices there if we can't stop it? You know, some advanced race that is so beyond our technologies that, you know, we would be just like ants to them. What could we possibly do to defend ourselves? And that's the thing. It's like you can only do what you can and try and be the best living creature you can, always trying to grow. This is a deep spiritual armor that you can wear, because even if you face ultimate annihilation through Armageddon, either man-made or through natural cataclysm, at least you know that you've done your absolute best to richly be a part of that event, and to stand with your head held high and your spirit rich with whatever goodness you have been able to harness with the people around you. So the world won't end, in a certain sense. The earth will continue, and life in that sense will go on. Humans might not be around, and something else might come afterwards. But whether we're looking backwards at where our origins come from, either from this planet or others, we have to think about what are we going to do in the future, either here or on other planets. We can't control the future, but we can plan for it. And as always, the only way we do that is with love and truth and togetherness. So the next time the government tells you that they know better and the truth is something you don't want to hear, just shake your fist at them and remind them that you are an incredible spiritual animal that has every right to make full decisions, because you are part of this cosmic universe, the very fabric of it. We all come from star matter and from this great explosion that created everything we see around us. Let no human tell you that they know better than you, but let us share information openly and try and make those decisions as best we can together, because that growing is, that's what matters. Everything that has a beginning will have an end, and there is a cycle to everything, but it's important that when that transition happens, that you do that as gracefully as you can, because that, I think, gives you the best feeling of having a fulfilled existence for that very, very, very short time that we are around on this earth and, cosmically speaking, in this reality and universe. So, incredible creatures, thank you so much for joining me in this episode of Storytime. It's going to be a wild ride, it seems, coming up, whether it's the solar maximums we're approaching, or the overdue polar shifts, or the chances of all kinds of volcanoes waking up and all kinds of things. It doesn't matter, really. Life will change, things will change, but it's what you make of it that counts. And so keep this in your mind and have a great week further. We'll catch you next week Sunday around the same time, maybe a little bit earlier if load shedding allows. You can always catch these episodes uploaded on YouTube at Prime Matter Podcast. We got the whole playlist there, so you can catch previous episodes or any bits that you may have missed or parts that you want to maybe pause and read and look at yourself. Drop us an email, drop us a note. Slapchippies, thank you so much for being around with us for the full series. It's nice to have you aboard on our team. And again, have a great week and keep the deep spiritual armor ready, because it's gonna be a bumpy ride. But if we're doing it together, it's only gonna be easier and a lot more fulfilling. And that's the whole point. Drink while you can and drink deep of life. Don't know when it's gonna start or end, so when it does, hold on to it with both hands. Ladies and gents, thank you so much for joining me for episode 24 of Storytime. We'll catch you next week. Have a great one. Euphoria, signing out. Much love.